A millionaire laughed at the female mechanic, but with grease on her hands, she proved she could change her own fate. And his. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Arthur Sterling built an empire on one belief, that worth was measured in zeros on a bank statement and letters after a name. At 38, he commanded boardrooms with surgical precision, wielding his Harvard MBA like a sword against anyone who dared question his superiority. His world was glass towers and Italian leather, where problems disappeared with the right amount of money and the correct connections. But on a crisp October morning, when his $3 million car died on a busy Hartford street, Arthur discovered that some problems cannot be solved with a checkbook. Enter Maisie Robinson, 29 years old, hands stained with honest grease, and a mind sharp enough to see through the lies that powerful men tell themselves. She would become the one person who could strip away his arrogance and show him what true wealth really meant. But first, she would have to survive his cruelty, and he would have to learn that sometimes the most valuable things in life come from the most unexpected places. "What are you going to do, miss? Blow on the engine?" Arthur Sterling's voice dripped with condescension as he stared at the young woman approaching his disabled Bentley. The October sun cast harsh shadows across Elm Street, where morning commuters slowed to gawk at the spectacle of Hartford's most ruthless CEO, stranded like any common citizen. Maisie Robinson paused, her green eyes taking in the man whose photograph graced magazine covers and whose reputation preceded him like a storm front. She had never seen Arthur Sterling in person, but his dismissive tone and the way he looked at her, as if she were an inconvenience rather than help, told her everything she needed to know. "I suppose I could try that," she replied, her voice steady, despite the flush of anger warming her cheeks, "though I suspect your car needs something more sophisticated than divine intervention." Arthur checked his platinum watch for the dozenth time. 9:15. His meeting with the Singapore investors was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp, a meeting that could secure the largest contract in Apex Innovation's history. $2 billion hung in the balance, and here he stood, trapped by a machine that had chosen the worst possible moment to betray him. "Listen, miss," he said, not bothering to ask her name, "I appreciate the gesture, but I need a real mechanic. Someone who actually knows what they are doing." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "I can pay you to flag down a proper repair service." Maisie set down her toolbox with deliberate care. She had inherited Robinson's auto repair from her grandfather 3 years ago, had earned her certification in luxury vehicle diagnostics from the best technical college in New England, and had spent countless hours mastering the intricate electronics that made modern cars function. But to Arthur Sterling, she was nothing more than a girl who had wandered over from some nearby garage. "Mr. Sterling," she said, surprising him by knowing his name, "your car is not going to start because it is not supposed to start. This is not a mechanical failure, it is sabotage." The word hung between them like a challenge. Arthur's expression shifted from impatience to skepticism. "Sabotage? That is ridiculous. This vehicle has more security features than Fort Knox. Security features that someone with the right knowledge could circumvent." Maisie opened her toolbox and retrieved a sophisticated diagnostic device. "Your Bentley uses the same electronic control unit as several other luxury models. If someone wanted to disable it remotely, they would only need access to the right frequency and about 10 minutes with the vehicle." Arthur watched, his skepticism wavering as she connected her equipment to hidden ports beneath the dashboard. Her movements were precise, confident, nothing like the fumbling he had expected from someone in coveralls. "This is absurd," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Who would want to sabotage my car? Someone who knew exactly when and where you would be driving this morning?" Maisie replied, her attention focused on the data streaming across her device's screen. Someone who understood that your usual assistant service would be conveniently unavailable. Someone who wanted you stranded at precisely 9:15 on Elm Street. The implications hit Arthur like cold water. His morning routine was carefully scheduled, his route to the office invariable. Only a handful of people knew his exact movements, and fewer still would have the technical expertise to execute such a plan. "How long will this take?" he asked, his earlier arrogance replaced by grudging curiosity. "That depends on how sophisticated the interference device is," Maisie said, not looking up from her work. "And whether you are willing to let me do what needs to be done, or if you would prefer to keep interrupting with suggestions about divine intervention." For the first time in years, Arthur Sterling found himself speechless. This woman, this mechanic, whose name he had not even bothered to learn, was speaking to him as an equal. More than that, she was treating him like a child who needed to be managed. "What is your name?" he asked, the question emerging before he could stop it. "Maisie Robinson." She glanced up briefly, meeting his eyes with a directness that made him unexpectedly uncomfortable. "And before you ask, yes, I am qualified to work on your car. I have specialized training in luxury vehicle electronics, including the specific security protocols Bentley uses in their latest models." Arthur felt something shift inside his chest, not quite respect, but perhaps the recognition that his assumptions might be flawed. He had built his empire on the belief that intelligence and capability correlated directly with credentials and social position. Yet here was someone who clearly possessed both, despite lacking the external markers he valued. "Mr. Sterling," Maisie said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "I can fix your car and get you to your meeting on time. But if you interrupt me again with offers to pay me to go away, or suggestions that I am not qualified for this work, I will pack up my tools and leave you to explain to your investors why you could not figure out how to call a taxi." The threat was delivered with such calm authority that Arthur felt his cheeks flush. He, who commanded respect in every room he entered, had just been dressed down by a woman whose existence he would have dismissed entirely 1 hour ago. "How much time do you need?" he asked quietly. 20 minutes, Maisie replied, already turning back to her diagnostic equipment. "And silence. Your engine is going to require surgery, not commentary." Arthur Sterling had never watched someone work with tools before, not real work, with hands that knew their purpose and minds that solved problems through skill rather than delegation. As Maisie disappeared beneath the hood of his Bentley, he found himself oddly fascinated by the quiet competence of her movements. "Your saboteur knew what they were doing," she called out, her voice muffled by the engine compartment. "This is military-grade electronic interference technology, not something you pick up at the local electronics store. Military-grade." Arthur moved closer, drawn despite himself by the implications. "You mean this was planned by professionals, or someone with access to professional equipment?" Maisie emerged, a small device in her palm that looked innocuous despite its sophisticated purpose. "This little beauty has been broadcasting a signal that convinced your car's computer that the engine was overheating. Every time you tried to start it, the safety protocols kicked in." Arthur stared at the device, his mind racing through possibilities. Corporate espionage was not unknown in his world, but this level of technical sophistication suggested resources and planning that went far beyond simple business competition. "Who has access to this kind of technology?" he asked. "Government contractors, military suppliers, certain tech companies with defense contracts." Maisie wiped her hands on a rag, leaving streaks of grease that somehow made her appear more competent rather than less. "Or anyone willing to pay enough to acquire it through less conventional channels." The list of people, with both motive and means, was shorter than Arthur wanted to admit. His business practices had made him enemies, but only a few possessed the resources for this kind of retaliation. Can you trace where it came from? Not from the device itself, but whoever installed this had physical access to your vehicle within the last week. Maisie's green eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made him pause. This is not random vandalism, Mr. Sterling. Someone has been studying your habits, your security, your weaknesses, and they wanted you trapped here at this exact time and place. Arthur felt vulnerability creep up his spine, an unfamiliar sensation that left him off balance. His world was built on control, on the ability to anticipate and manage every variable. The idea that someone had been watching him, planning against him, violated the fundamental assumptions that governed his life. "Why tell me this?" he asked. "You could have simply fixed the car and collected your fee." Maisie packed her tools with the same methodical precision she had used to diagnose the problem. "Because whoever did this expects you to dismiss me as irrelevant. They are counting on your assumption that someone like me could not possibly understand the sophisticated nature of their plan." The observation stung because it was accurate. Arthur realized that until this moment, he had seen Maisie exactly as his enemy wanted him to, as beneath notice, incapable of the insights that might threaten their scheme. "Someone like you," he repeated slowly. "A woman. A mechanic. Someone without a college degree or a corner office." Maisie's voice remained steady, but Arthur caught the flash of pain that crossed her features. "Someone whose opinion you would never think to ask, whose observations you would never consider credible." Arthur felt heat rise in his cheeks as he recognized the accuracy of her assessment. How many times had he dismissed input from people who did not fit his narrow definition of expertise? How many insights had he missed because they came from sources he deemed unworthy of consideration? "Your car will start now," Maisie said, closing her toolbox with a definitive snap. "You should reach your meeting with 10 minutes to spare." She turned to leave, but Arthur found himself speaking before conscious thought caught up with intention. "Wait," Maisie paused, one eyebrow raised in question. "I owe you an apology," Arthur said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "My behavior this morning was inexcusable. You came to help, and I treated you with disrespect." "Yes, you did." Maisie's directness continued to surprise him. "But apologies are just words, Mr. Sterling. The question is whether you have learned anything from this experience, or whether you will go back to your office and continue treating people as disposable based on their job titles." Arthur opened his mouth to protest, then closed it as he realized he had no answer that would not sound hollow. She was right. In 30 minutes, this woman had shown him expertise he lacked, insights he had missed, and courage he rarely witnessed in his corporate environment. Yet his first instinct remained to categorize her as somehow lesser. "What would it take," he asked carefully, "for you to help me figure out who did this?" Maisie studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity against her better judgment. "It would take you treating me as an equal partner in the investigation, not as hired help to be managed. It would require you to listen when I speak, even if my insights challenge your assumptions. And it would mean acknowledging that intelligence comes in many forms, not all of which are validated by expensive degrees." The conditions were more challenging than any contract Arthur had ever negotiated, because they demanded something he rarely offered: genuine respect for someone outside his carefully constructed hierarchy. "Agreed," he said, surprising himself with the speed of his decision. Maisie's expression shifted slightly, skepticism giving way to cautious curiosity. Why does this matter enough to you that you would work with someone you clearly consider beneath your notice? Arthur considered the question, reaching for honesty that felt uncomfortable but necessary. "Because in 30 minutes you have shown me that my assumptions about intelligence, capability, and worth might be fundamentally flawed." And because whoever orchestrated this attack succeeded precisely because they understood those flaws better than I did. For the first time since their encounter began, Maisie smiled, not with triumph, but with something that might have been approval. In that case, Mr. Sterling, we need to have a serious conversation about the enemies you have made. Maisie's garage occupied a corner lot 3 blocks from downtown Hartford, wedged between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner in a neighborhood that money had not yet discovered. Arthur's Bentley looked absurdly out of place as he pulled into the gravel parking area, its polished chrome reflecting the afternoon sun like a beacon announcing his presence to anyone who might be watching. Not exactly your usual environment, Maisie observed as she unlocked the main bay door. Arthur stepped carefully over a puddle of motor oil, his Italian leather shoes clearly not designed for such terrain. No, it is not. The interior of Robinson's Auto Repair was a study in organized chaos. Tools hung in precise arrangements along the walls, parts bins labeled in Maisie's careful handwriting, and diagnostic equipment that Arthur now recognized as far more sophisticated than he had assumed. The scent of motor oil and metal polish created an atmosphere that was foreign, yet oddly comforting. "This was your grandfather's business?" Arthur asked, genuinely curious. "For 42 years." Maisie's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness. "He started with nothing but a toolbox and a dream of fixing things that others had given up on. Built this place into something that mattered to people." Arthur examined a framed photograph on the workbench, a much younger Maisie standing beside an elderly man whose eyes held the same steady intelligence as his granddaughter's. Both wore coveralls and grease-stained smiles, their hands resting on the hood of a restored 1957 Chevrolet. "He taught you everything." "Everything about engines, yes. But more than that, he taught me that honest work has dignity, regardless of whether other people recognize it." Maisie pulled out a laptop and several technical manuals. "He also taught me never to let anyone make me feel small because of what I do for a living." The comment landed with precision, reminding Arthur of his behavior that morning. He set down the photograph carefully, aware that he was handling something precious. "Tell me about this interference device," he said, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. Maisie opened her laptop and pulled up a series of technical specifications. "The model we found in your car is manufactured by Sentinel Technologies, a defense contractor based in Virginia. They produce electronic warfare equipment for military and intelligence applications." "Sentinel Technologies?" Arthur frowned, the name triggering a vague memory. "I know that company. They bid on a project for us 2 years ago." "What kind of project?" "Cybersecurity infrastructure for our new research facility. We were developing proprietary software for autonomous vehicle systems." Arthur's frown deepened as connections began forming. "The contract was worth $50 million. Who got the contract?" "We ultimately decided to develop the system in-house. It was more expensive, but it gave us complete control over the technology." Arthur paused, realization dawning. The decision cost several companies significant revenue, including Sentinel. Maisie pulled up another screen, this one showing purchase records for similar devices. Someone acquired 3 of these units 6 months ago through a shell corporation called Phoenix Acquisitions. The billing address traces to a post office box in Delaware. "Phoenix Acquisitions." Arthur shook his head. "I have never heard of them. Neither have most people. It is a standard setup for hiding the real purchaser." Maisie turned the laptop toward him. "But the payment method is interesting. The purchase was made with a corporate credit card linked to an account at Whitmore Financial." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. "Whitmore Financial. You know them?" "I used to work there." Arthur sank into a folding chair, his mind racing through implications. "It was my first job out of Harvard. I spent 3 years learning the business before I left to take over my father's company." Anyone there who might hold a grudge? Arthur considered the question, sifting through memories of office politics and professional rivalries. One name surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. Julian Hart, he said quietly. Who is Julian Hart? My former mentor. He brought me into Whitmore, taught me everything I knew about corporate strategy. Arthur rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of old grievances. When I left to rebuild my father's company, Julian felt betrayed. He had expected me to remain at Whitmore, eventually taking over his position. What happened instead? I succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible. Apex Innovations became worth more in 5 years than Julian had achieved in 20. It destroyed our relationship and created a rivalry that has only grown more bitter with time. Maisie leaned against the workbench, studying Arthur's expression. Bitter enough for him to sabotage your car? Julian is brilliant, vindictive, and possesses exactly the kind of resources necessary for this type of operation. Arthur stood, pacing the small space as pieces fell into place. He would know my schedule, my habits, my security protocols, and he would understand that attacking me during a crucial business meeting would cause maximum damage. So what do we do about it? The question stopped Arthur mid-stride. In his world, problems were solved through lawyers, corporate pressure, and carefully applied financial leverage. But this situation demanded a different approach, one that required skills he did not possess. I honestly do not know, he admitted. My usual methods would alert Julian that we have discovered his involvement, and anything we do through official channels would take weeks to produce results. Maisie nodded thoughtfully. Then we need to think like Julian thinks. He orchestrated this attack because he believed you would respond predictably, with anger, legal threats, and corporate retaliation. What if we gave him exactly what he expects, while quietly gathering evidence he does not see coming? Arthur felt something shift in his chest, not just respect for Maisie's tactical thinking, but admiration for the way her mind worked. She approached problems with a combination of analytical precision and creative flexibility that complemented his own strategic training. You have experience with this kind of investigation. I have experience fixing things that are broken, Maisie replied. Whether it is an engine or a conspiracy, the process is similar. You start with symptoms, trace them to their source, and then you repair the damage. Arthur found himself smiling despite the seriousness of their situation. So where do we start? We start by giving Julian Hart exactly what he wants to see. The executive conference room at Apex Innovations buzzed with tension as Arthur Sterling faced his board of directors. The afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the faces of men and women who had built their careers on reading power dynamics and protecting their investments. The Singapore contract has been postponed indefinitely, Arthur announced, his voice carrying none of the frustration that had consumed him that morning. Technical difficulties prevented me from attending this morning's presentation. Board member Patricia leaned forward, her silver hair catching the light. Technical difficulties. Arthur, this was a $2 billion opportunity. What kind of technical difficulties justify missing such a crucial meeting? My vehicle experienced an electronic malfunction that left me stranded for 2 hours, Arthur replied smoothly. By the time I reached the hotel, our contacts had already committed to reviewing other proposals. The explanation was crafted to sound like exactly the kind of petty inconvenience that could derail even the most important plans. Believable, embarrassing, and ultimately Arthur's fault for not having better contingency systems. 2 hours. Richard Blackstone, the longest-serving board member, shook his head in disbelief. Arthur, you are one of the most organized executives I know. How does a car breakdown result in missing the most important meeting of the year? Arthur allowed frustration to creep into his voice, knowing it would sell the performance. Because my usual assistance service was unavailable, and I was forced to rely on a local mechanic who took an unreasonable amount of time to complete what should have been a simple repair. The dismissive tone came easily, requiring no acting ability whatsoever. Around the table, board members exchanged glances that mixed sympathy with concern about Arthur's judgment. "What are the implications for our quarterly projections?" Patricia asked. "Significant," Arthur admitted. "We were counting on the Singapore revenue to offset development costs for the autonomous vehicle project. Without it, we will need to explore alternative funding sources or scale back our timeline." The meeting continued for another hour, with Arthur playing the role of a CEO frustrated by circumstances beyond his control. He answered questions with appropriate contrition, accepted criticism with professional grace, and maintained the facade of someone whose empire had been wounded by a mechanical failure and poor planning. As the board members filed out, Arthur remained in his chair, staring at the Hartford skyline through windows that had once made him feel invincible. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "How did the meeting go?" Arthur smiled grimly as he typed his response. "Exactly as planned." 20 minutes later, he was back in his Bentley, driving toward a destination that would have baffled his former self. Robinson's Auto Repair represented everything he had spent his career avoiding: manual labor, practical problems, and the kind of honest work that produced no quarterly profits. Yet as he pulled into the gravel lot, Arthur felt something he had not experienced in years: anticipation. Maisie emerged from the main bay, wiping her hands on a shop towel. She had changed from her morning coveralls into jeans and a simple sweater that somehow made her appear both professional and approachable. "How convincing was your performance?" she asked. "Oscar-worthy," Arthur replied. "The board believes I am a careless executive who lost a major contract due to poor planning and bad luck." "Good. That means Julian will hear exactly what he wants to hear." Maisie gestured toward the garage. "I have been researching Sentinel Technologies and their relationship with Whitmore Financial. What I found is interesting." Inside the garage, Maisie had transformed one corner into an investigation center. Documents, photographs, and technical specifications covered a folding table, connected by colored strings that mapped relationships Arthur had never considered. "Julian Hart sits on Sentinel's advisory board," she began, pointing to a corporate filing. "He has been there for 3 years, ever since Apex Innovations rejected their cybersecurity proposal." Arthur studied the documents, recognizing the methodical thoroughness that had impressed him during the morning's car repair. "This suggests premeditation going back years." "It gets better. Phoenix Acquisitions, the shell company that purchased the interference devices, was established 6 months after your Singapore opportunity became public knowledge. Someone has been planning this attack since the moment they learned about your meeting." The timeline painted a picture of sophisticated, long-term strategy that Arthur both admired and feared. Julian had not acted in anger or frustration. He had orchestrated a careful campaign designed to damage Arthur's reputation and business prospects. "There is more," Maisie continued, pulling up another document. "Sentinel Technologies recently submitted a proposal to provide security consulting for the Singapore consortium. If your deal had fallen through, they would have been perfectly positioned to step in as advisors." Arthur felt anger building in his chest, not the explosive rage that usually accompanied professional setbacks, but the cold fury of someone who had been systematically betrayed. "Julian was not just trying to hurt me," he said slowly. "He was positioning himself to profit from my failure." "Exactly. And because the sabotage appeared to be a simple mechanical failure, no one would have connected it to corporate espionage or questioned his subsequent involvement with the consortium." Arthur sank into a folding chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Julian's planning and his own blindness to the threat. For all his strategic training and business acumen, he had been outmaneuvered by someone who understood him better than he understood himself. "How do we prove it?" he asked. "We need evidence that directly connects Julian to the purchase of the interference devices. Corporate filings and advisory board positions create suspicion, but they do not prove criminal activity." Maisie pulled up a new screen showing surveillance footage from a parking garage. "This is from the security camera at Apex Innovations 3 days ago. Someone with access to your vehicle installed the interference device while you were in your morning meeting." Arthur leaned closer, studying the grainy image of a figure in a maintenance uniform working beneath his car. The person's face was obscured, but their movements suggested familiarity with both the vehicle and the facility. "Who has access to the executive parking garage?" "Employees, contractors, and anyone with a valid security badge," Maisie replied. "But the timing is specific. This person knew exactly when you would be in your Monday morning strategy meeting." Arthur felt pieces clicking into place with mechanical precision. "Only 5 people have access to my calendar with that level of detail. My assistant, my driver, my security coordinator, and 2 board members, which suggests Julian has someone inside your organization." The betrayal cut deeper than the original sabotage. Arthur had built Apex Innovations on principles of loyalty and mutual respect, believing that success would create natural bonds among his team. To learn that someone in his inner circle had been working against him violated fundamental assumptions about human nature. "How do we identify the insider?" Maisie smiled, with what might have been anticipation. "We give them something irresistible to report back to Julian, and then we watch what happens next." Arthur Sterling had never sat on a concrete floor before, but as he watched Maisie explain her plan, he found himself oddly comfortable in the organized chaos of her grandfather's garage. The evening light filtered through windows that had not been cleaned in months, casting everything in a golden glow that made even motor oil stains appear somehow artistic. "Julian's entire strategy depends on you responding predictably," Maisie said, pulling up a new document on her laptop. "He expects you to investigate through corporate channels, hire expensive lawyers, and make enough noise to warn him that you are coming." Arthur nodded, recognizing the accuracy of her assessment. "Those are exactly the methods I would normally use." "Which is why we are going to do the opposite." Maisie turned the screen toward him, revealing what appeared to be a standard corporate memo. "Tomorrow morning, you are going to announce a new security initiative at Apex Innovations. Enhanced background checks, electronic surveillance of all vehicles, and a comprehensive review of access protocols. That will certainly get Julian's attention. More importantly, it will panic whoever is feeding him information. People can maintain composure when they believe their activities are undetected, but paranoia makes them careless." Arthur studied the memo, admiring the psychological sophistication behind Maisie's approach. "You want to force them into making a mistake. I want to force them into contacting Julian for instructions, and when they do, we will be watching." She pulled up another screen showing a software interface that Arthur did not recognize. "I have a friend who specializes in digital forensics. He can monitor communications from your office network and identify unusual contact patterns." "That sounds like it might be illegal." Maisie's green eyes fixed on his with steady intensity. "So is corporate sabotage. The question is whether you want to catch Julian using methods that will hold up in court, or whether you want to play by rules that he has already broken." The choice represented more than tactical strategy. It challenged Arthur's fundamental beliefs about how problems should be solved. His entire career had been built on working within established systems, using money and influence to achieve goals through official channels. "What you are suggesting would require me to trust you completely," he said. "Yes, it would. To rely on people I have never met, using methods I do not understand. Yes, Arthur stood and walked to the window, looking out at a neighborhood where people solved problems through skill and resourcefulness rather than corporate procedures. The world Maisie inhabited operated by different rules, more personal, more direct, but also more honest about the realities of conflict. "Why are you willing to help me?" he asked, turning back to face her. "This morning I treated you with disrespect and contempt. You have every reason to walk away and let me handle this alone." Maisie was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Because Julian Hart represents everything that is wrong with how powerful people treat those they consider beneath them. He assumes that someone like me is irrelevant, that my insights and capabilities do not matter. Proving him wrong feels like justice." "And what about proving me wrong?" "You are learning," she said simply. "Julian is not." The distinction mattered more than Arthur expected. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on intelligence and adaptability, but those qualities had been constrained by prejudices that limited what he was willing to learn and from whom he was willing to learn it. "If we do this," he said carefully, "and if we succeed in exposing Julian, what then? My business will survive, my reputation will recover, and I will go back to my corner office and my executive meetings. But your life will be disrupted by investigations, legal proceedings, and media attention you never asked for." Maisie considered the question with the same methodical approach she brought to mechanical problems. "My grandfather used to say that some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. The only real choice is whether you face them with courage or let them defeat you through inaction." Arthur felt something shift inside his chest, not just respect or admiration, but something deeper that he was not ready to name. This woman, who had every reason to avoid complications and protect her quiet life, was willing to risk everything to help him fight a battle that was not originally hers. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Complete honesty about your business, your enemies, and your weaknesses. Julian has been studying you for years, which means we need to understand you better than he does." The requirement was more challenging than any contract negotiation Arthur had ever faced. Corporate leadership was largely about maintaining facades, presenting strength and certainty even when facing doubt and confusion. What Maisie asked would require vulnerability he had not shown since childhood. "And if my honesty reveals things that change your opinion of me, then I will deal with those revelations when they come," Maisie replied. "But right now, the enemy we face is someone who profits from keeping people isolated, suspicious, and unable to trust each other. The best way to defeat him is to do exactly the opposite." Arthur looked around the garage one more time, taking in the tools that had built something meaningful, the photographs that documented a life of honest work, and the woman who had inherited both the burden and the privilege of continuing that legacy. "In that case," he said, extending his hand, to partners. Maisie smiled as she shook his hand, her calloused palm strong and sure against his. Partners. For the first time in his adult life, Arthur Sterling had entered into an agreement that offered no guarantees, provided no legal protections, and depended entirely on mutual trust between two people who had known each other for less than 12 hours. It felt terrifying. It felt necessary. And somewhere deep in his chest, it felt like the beginning of something that might change everything he thought he knew about himself. The digital forensics laboratory occupied the basement of a converted warehouse in Hartford's Arts District, where flickering neon signs from vintage shops cast rainbow shadows across rain-slicked streets. Arthur followed Maisie down a narrow staircase, leaving behind the familiar world of glass towers and entering a realm where technology served truth rather than profit. "Danny Chen is the best digital investigator on the East Coast," Maisie explained, as they approached a steel door marked only with a number. "He used to work for the FBI before he decided government bureaucracy was slowing down actual justice." Arthur adjusted his tie nervously. aware that his tailored suit made him conspicuous in this neighborhood of artists and activists. "How do you know him?" "He helped me prove insurance fraud when someone claimed my grandfather's garage caused damage we never touched." Maisie knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. Danny understands that small businesses need protection from people with expensive lawyers and flexible ethics. The door opened to reveal a slight man in his 30s, whose intense dark eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of Arthur's appearance in seconds. Danny Chen wore jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, but his workspace beyond the threshold hummed with equipment that Arthur recognized as worth several $1 million. "So you are the CEO who got schooled by a mechanic," Danny said without preamble, his voice carrying amusement rather than judgment. Arthur felt heat rise in his cheeks, unsure whether the comment was meant as an insult or an observation. "I suppose that is one way to describe this morning's events." "Danny," Maisie intervened smoothly, "Arthur needs our help exposing corporate sabotage. Someone with serious resources has been planning his destruction for months." Danny's expression shifted to professional interest as he gestured them inside. The laboratory was a maze of servers, monitors, and analysis equipment that filled the basement with electronic humming and flashing lights. Multiple screens displayed data streams, network diagrams, and surveillance footage from sources Arthur preferred not to contemplate. "Corporate espionage is my specialty," Danny said, settling into a chair surrounded by keyboards and input devices. "But I work exclusively for people who have been wronged by those with more money and power. Your friend Maisie says you qualify, but I need to understand why a billionaire CEO needs underground help instead of hiring official investigators." Arthur looked around the room, taking in equipment that could probably penetrate any security system ever created. This was power of a different kind, technical expertise wielded in service of justice rather than profit. It made him profoundly uncomfortable and oddly hopeful simultaneously. "Because the person trying to destroy me knows exactly how official investigations work," Arthur said. "He has spent years studying my methods, my contacts, and my resources. Anything I do through conventional channels will be anticipated and countered." Danny pulled up Arthur's corporate profile on one of his monitors, scrolling through public information with practiced efficiency. "Julian Hart, your former mentor at Whitmore Financial, currently runs Titan Industries and sits on multiple advisory boards. The man has serious connections in both private and government sectors. You know him." "I know his reputation. Hart specializes in acquiring intelligence about his competitors through methods that are technically legal but ethically questionable. He has turned corporate espionage into an art form." Maisie leaned against a workstation, her attention focused on Danny's analysis. "Can you prove he purchased the interference devices that disabled Arthur's car?" "Possibly. But proving purchase is not the same as proving deployment." Danny's fingers flew across multiple keyboards simultaneously. "What we need is evidence that Hart not only acquired the technology, but actively used it to attack a specific target on a specific date." Arthur watched data flow across screens with hypnotic complexity, realizing that this investigation required skills and resources he had never imagined. His world of board meetings and financial leverage felt primitive compared to the technical sophistication Danny wielded with casual expertise. "How long will this take?" Arthur asked. "That depends on how careful Hart has been and how lucky we get with digital breadcrumbs." Danny paused his typing to look directly at Arthur. "But I should warn you, this kind of investigation creates risks. If Hart discovers we're digging into his activities, he will almost certainly escalate his attacks." "What kind of escalation?" "The interference device was elegant and subtle. Next time, he might choose methods that are neither." Danny's expression grew serious. "Corporate sabotage can escalate quickly into personal threats, especially when the perpetrator feels cornered." Arthur felt cold fear settle in his stomach. Not for himself, but for Maisie. She had chosen to help him fight a battle that was not originally hers, and now that choice might expose her to dangers he had not considered. "Maybe I should handle this alone," he said quietly. "Too late for second thoughts," Maisie replied, her voice carrying determination that brooked no argument. Julian Hart represents everything wrong with how powerful people abuse those they consider beneath them. "This is exactly the kind of fight my grandfather would have wanted me to finish." Danny nodded approvingly. "Besides, Hart has already identified both of you as threats. Separating now would just make you easier targets." The logic was sound but unsettling. Arthur had spent his career managing calculated risks in controlled environments. This situation offered no guarantees, no safety protocols, and no institutional protection against an enemy who played by different rules. "What do you need from us?" Maisie asked. "Access to Arthur's corporate network, personnel files, and communication logs, plus detailed information about everyone who knew his schedule for the day of the sabotage." Danny pulled up a secure interface. "And I need you both to understand that once we start this investigation, there is no going back. Hart will know someone is coming for him, and he will respond accordingly." Arthur thought about his comfortable life, his predictable routines, and his carefully constructed world where problems were solved through proper channels and established procedures. Everything Danny described would shatter that security permanently. "Arthur," Maisie's voice was gentle but insistent, "what do you want to do?" He looked at her, this woman who had entered his life 12 hours ago and turned every assumption upside down. She stood surrounded by technology that could topple governments, willing to fight battles that were not hers, asking nothing except honesty and partnership. "I want to stop Julian Hart from hurting anyone else," Arthur said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Whatever that requires." Danny smiled for the first time since they had arrived. "In that case, let us go hunting." 3 days of investigation had transformed Arthur's understanding of vulnerability. He sat in his corner office watching Hartford's business district through floor-to-ceiling windows, aware that every phone call, every email, and every movement was potentially being monitored by an enemy who had turned surveillance into warfare. Danny's preliminary findings painted a picture of systematic infiltration that went far beyond simple corporate rivalry. Julian Hart had spent 2 years building a network of informants, contractors, and technical specialists dedicated to gathering intelligence about Apex innovations and Arthur's personal life. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. "Mr. Sterling," his assistant Rebecca knocked softly before entering. "The security consultants are here for your 3 o'clock appointment." Arthur nodded, maintaining the facade of an executive responding to recent security concerns rather than someone conducting a covert investigation. "Send them in, please." Rebecca withdrew, and moments later 2 men in expensive suits entered his office. Arthur recognized the type immediately. Former law enforcement or military personnel who had transitioned into private security consulting. Their presence was part of the performance he and Maisie had orchestrated to flush out Julian's insider. "Mr. Sterling, I am David Walsh from Meridian Security Solutions," the older man said, extending his hand. "We understand you are concerned about recent technical failures and want to implement comprehensive protection protocols." Arthur shook hands, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested genuine competence. "Recent events have made me realize that our current security measures are inadequate. I need to know that my vehicles, communications, and facilities are protected against sophisticated threats. We specialize in protection against exactly the kind of electronic warfare you experienced," Walsh's partner added. "Our services include vehicle hardening, communication encryption, and facility surveillance that would detect any unauthorized access." The meeting continued for 45 minutes, with Arthur asking detailed questions about security protocols, while carefully mentioning his schedule, travel plans, and concerns about potential threats. Every word was designed to provide Julian's insider with irresistible intelligence to report back to their handler. After the security consultants left, Arthur remained in his office, staring at his phone and waiting for Danny's call. The digital forensics specialist had positioned monitoring equipment to detect any unusual communication patterns following the security meeting. When his phone finally rang, Arthur answered on the first ring. "We got him!" Danny's voice carried satisfaction and excitement. 15 minutes after your meeting ended, someone in your organization contacted a burner phone registered to Phoenix Acquisitions. The call lasted exactly 90 seconds, long enough to report what you discussed, but brief enough to avoid detailed tracking. Arthur felt vindication mixed with betrayal. Were you able to identify who made the call? Even better, the call originated from the phone of Patricia Wynne, your board member. The name hit Arthur like physical impact. Patricia had been with Apex Innovations since its founding, had mentored him through early challenges, and had become someone he trusted implicitly. To learn that she had been feeding information to Julian Hart violated every assumption about loyalty and friendship. Are you certain? Phone records, voice analysis, and location data all confirm it was Patricia's device. She called Julian's number immediately after your security meeting and has been in regular contact with Phoenix Acquisitions for the past 6 months. Arthur sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the personal dimension of the betrayal. Patricia was not just a business associate. She was someone he had considered family, whose opinion he valued, whose loyalty he had never questioned. "Arthur!" Maisie's voice came through his office intercom. "Are you available? I have something important to show you." "Send her in," Arthur replied, grateful for her presence as he processed Danny's revelations. Maisie entered, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that mixed anger with determination. She had spent the morning visiting automotive parts suppliers, following a lead about the sophisticated device that had disabled Arthur's car. "I found where Julian acquired the technical specifications for your Bentley's security system," she announced without preamble. 3 months ago, someone claiming to work for Apex Innovations requested detailed electrical schematics from Bentley's technical support division. Arthur looked up from Danny's phone call findings. "Someone impersonating our company. Someone with enough internal knowledge to provide convincing credentials and authorization codes." Maisie set her tablet on his desk, displaying email communications between the imposter and Bentley's technical staff. The request was made using Patricia Wynne's corporate email account and digital signature. The evidence created a complete picture that Arthur could no longer deny. Patricia had not simply been reporting his activities to Julian, she had been actively facilitating the sabotage by providing technical intelligence and corporate access. "How long has this been going on?" Arthur asked quietly. "Based on communication patterns Danny identified, at least 8 months. Patricia has been feeding Julian detailed information about your business operations, personal schedule, security protocols, and strategic planning." Arthur felt something fundamental break inside his chest, not just professional disappointment, but personal devastation at learning that someone he trusted had been systematically betraying him for months. "Why?" he asked, though he was not certain he wanted to know the answer. Maisie sat down across from his desk, her expression gentle but honest. "Danny found financial records showing regular payments from Phoenix Acquisitions to a consulting firm Patricia established 6 months ago. Julian has been paying her $50,000 per month for intelligence about Apex Innovations." The amount was significant, but not life-changing for someone with Patricia's resources, which meant her betrayal was motivated by something more personal than financial necessity. She felt passed over, Arthur realized suddenly. "When I restructured the company 2 years ago, Patricia expected to be promoted to Chief Operating Officer. Instead, I brought in someone from outside. Corporate decisions that seemed purely professional to you might have felt like personal rejection to her. Maisie agreed. Julian understands how to exploit those feelings of resentment and abandonment. Arthur stood and walked to his windows, looking down at the city where he had built his empire without understanding the human costs of his decisions. Patricia's betrayal was devastating, but it was also educational, a lesson about the difference between demanding loyalty and earning it. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We use Patricia's access to feed Julian false information while we gather evidence of his broader conspiracy," Maisie replied, "and we prepare for his response when he realizes he has been discovered." Arthur turned back to face her, struck by the calm competence with which she approached problems that left him feeling lost and overwhelmed. In 3 days, this woman had become his anchor in a world where everything he had believed about trust and loyalty was proving false. "Maisie," he said carefully, "I need you to know that whatever happens next, I am grateful you chose to help me. You could have fixed my car and walked away, but instead you have risked your safety and your business to fight for justice. That means more to me than I know how to express." She smiled, and for a moment the tension in the room softened into something warmer. "Arthur, 3 days ago you were just another arrogant CEO who treated me like hired help. But you have been willing to learn, to change, and to admit when you were wrong. That kind of growth gives me hope." Arthur felt heat spread through his chest. Not embarrassment this time, but something deeper and more complicated. He was beginning to understand that his feelings for Maisie went far beyond gratitude or professional respect. She had become someone whose opinion mattered more than board approval, whose safety concerned him more than quarterly profits. "We should probably get back to work," he said, though he made no move toward his desk. "Probably," Maisie agreed, though she remained seated, looking at him with an expression he could not quite interpret. For a moment, the space between them felt charged with possibilities that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Then Arthur's phone rang, breaking the spell and returning them to the dangerous work of exposing a conspiracy that grew more complex with each revelation. The coffee shop near Danny's laboratory had become their unofficial headquarters, a neutral location where a billionaire CEO and a mechanic could meet without attracting attention. Arthur had grown fond of the mismatched furniture and locally sourced pastries, finding comfort in an environment where his expensive suits and corporate title meant nothing. "Julian is getting nervous," Danny announced as he slid into the booth across from Arthur and Maisie. "His communication patterns have shifted from routine intelligence gathering to active crisis management." Arthur looked up from the technical documents spread across their table. "What kind of crisis management?" "Encrypted communications with contacts in law enforcement, media, and political circles. He is preparing multiple attack vectors in case his original strategy fails." Danny pulled out his laptop and connected to the coffee shop's Wi-Fi through what Arthur assumed were several layers of security. "The man has contingency plans for his contingency plans." Maisie stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Which means he suspects we are onto him. More than suspects. Yesterday's false intelligence we fed through Patricia triggered immediate responses from 3 different Julian Hart associates. He knows someone is actively investigating his operations." Arthur felt familiar anxiety tighten in his chest. "How much time do we have before he escalates?" "Based on previous patterns, Julian prefers to act decisively rather than allow opposition to build momentum. I would estimate 72 hours before he implements whatever strategy he is currently developing." The timeline was shorter than Arthur had hoped, but longer than he had feared. "What kind of strategy?" Danny hesitated, exchanging glances with Maisie before answering. "Julian's background includes political warfare and media manipulation. If he feels threatened, he will likely shift from covert sabotage to public destruction." "Meaning what, exactly?" meaning he will try to destroy your reputation through scandal, leaked information, and coordinated media attacks. Instead of hiding his involvement, he will position himself as someone exposing your supposed crimes and incompetence. Arthur leaned back in his booth, contemplating the implications. Corporate sabotage was containable and defendable through traditional legal channels. Public relations warfare was messier, more personal, and potentially devastating to everyone connected to him. "He will come after both of us," Maisie said quietly, voicing Arthur's fears. "Probably. Julian understands that your partnership represents his greatest threat. Separating you or discrediting your relationship would serve multiple strategic purposes." Arthur looked at Maisie, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way her hands remained steady despite the escalating danger. She had signed up to help expose corporate sabotage, not to become the target of a sophisticated media assassination campaign. "You should distance yourself from this," he said. "Julian has no reason to attack you if you are not actively involved in the investigation." "Arthur Sterling," Maisie's voice carried a tone he had learned to recognize as non-negotiable, "if you suggest I abandon this fight because it might get difficult, I will walk out of here and you can face Julian Hart alone. I am trying to protect you. I do not need protection. I need partnership." Her green eyes fixed on his with laser intensity. "Julian Hart represents everything that is wrong with how powerful people treat those they consider disposable. If we let him win through intimidation, we validate his entire world view." Danny nodded approvingly. "Besides, Julian has already identified Maisie as a threat. Backing down now would not eliminate the danger. It would just leave her without allies to help fight it." The logic was sound, but troubling. Arthur realized that his desire to protect Maisie had drawn her deeper into a conflict that could damage her life in ways he had not anticipated. The responsibility felt heavier than any business decision he had ever made. "What do we need to do in the next 72 hours?" Arthur asked. "We need irrefutable evidence of Julian's crimes and a strategy for presenting that evidence in a way that prevents him from controlling the narrative." Danny pulled up several files on his laptop. "I have been building a comprehensive case file, but we need one more piece, direct proof that Julian personally ordered the sabotage of your vehicle." "How do we get that?" "We force him to make another move," Maisie said, understanding dawning in her expression. "We give him a target too tempting to resist and make sure we are recording when he takes the bait." Arthur felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the direction of their planning. "You want to use me as bait." "We want to use both of you as bait," Danny corrected. "Julian's greatest fear is that your partnership will inspire others to challenge established power structures. If we can convince him that you are planning something that threatens his entire network, he will be forced to respond personally." The plan was elegant, dangerous, and absolutely terrifying. Arthur had spent his career managing risk through analysis and planning, but what Danny proposed required accepting uncertainty and trusting people whose methods he barely understood. "What kind of response are we hoping to provoke?" "Julian will try to eliminate the threat through direct action rather than continued manipulation. That means he will have to communicate with his network, coordinate resources, and leave digital evidence of criminal conspiracy." Maisie reached across the table and touched Arthur's hand, the first time she had initiated physical contact since their partnership began. Her fingers were warm and calloused, grounding him in a reality that felt increasingly surreal. "Arthur, I know this is not how you're used to solving problems, but Julian Hart has spent 2 years studying your conventional methods and developing counters for each one. The only way to defeat him is to do something completely unexpected." Arthur looked down at their joined hands, aware that this moment represented a choice between the safe, predictable world he had always known and something entirely new. Maisie was offering partnership that went beyond professional collaboration. She was offering trust that required him to become someone different from the man he had been. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Danny smiled as he began outlining their strategy. "We need you to announce something that will make Julian Hart desperate enough to expose himself completely." Arthur squeezed Maisie's hand gently, drawing strength from her steady confidence. "In that case, let us give him something to be desperate about." For the first time since this ordeal began, Arthur felt anticipation rather than anxiety. Working with Maisie and Danny had taught him that strength could come from cooperation rather than control, that intelligence existed in many forms, and that some problems could only be solved by people willing to trust each other completely. Julian Hart was about to learn the same lessons, whether he wanted to or not. The Hartwell Hotel's ballroom glittered with Hartford's business elite, their conversations mixing quarterly projections with charity auction bids in the comfortable rhythm of corporate social events. Arthur Sterling worked the room with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries while his mind focused on the performance he and Maisie had carefully choreographed. "Arthur, wonderful to see you recovered from last week's technical difficulties," smiled Margaret Westbrook, publisher of Hartford Business Weekly. "I heard the Singapore opportunity might still be salvageable." "Actually, Margaret, I have decided to take Apex Innovations in a completely new direction," Arthur replied, pitching his voice to carry to nearby conversations. "Sometimes setbacks force us to see opportunities we would have missed otherwise." He had Maisie's full attention from across the room, where she stood near the silent auction tables wearing an elegant black dress that transformed her from mechanic to mystery. The contrast was striking. She commanded attention through natural grace rather than expensive accessories, proving that confidence needed no external validation. "What kind of new direction?" Margaret's journalistic instincts were clearly piqued. "Community partnership initiatives. I have realized that Apex Innovations has been too isolated from the people and businesses that make Hartford strong." Arthur accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, using the pause to gauge reactions from other listeners. "We are going to start investing directly in local entrepreneurs, particularly those in skilled trades and technical services." The announcement was carefully calculated to sound like corporate philanthropy, while hinting at the deeper partnership between Arthur and Maisie. Anyone monitoring his activities would interpret this as evidence of their growing alliance and potential threat to established power structures. "That sounds wonderfully progressive," Margaret said, though Arthur caught the slight skepticism in her voice. "Any specific partnerships you are considering?" "I am working with Robinson's Auto Repair to develop training programs for women in technical fields. Maisie Robinson has shown me that expertise and innovation exist in every corner of our community. We just need to stop overlooking them." Arthur saw Maisie's slight smile from across the room, a shared acknowledgement of how far they had both traveled from their first confrontational encounter. She had taught him to see value in places he had never looked, while he was learning to use his resources to amplify voices that deserved hearing. "The Robinson family has an excellent reputation," Margaret agreed. "Will this partnership involve significant financial investment? Significant enough to make a real difference? Sometimes the best business decisions are also the right moral choices." Arthur excused himself from the conversation and moved toward the auction tables, where Maisie was examining framed photographs of Hartford's historical landmarks. She had positioned herself perfectly, close enough to overhear important conversations while appearing casually interested in the charity items. "Learning anything interesting?" he asked quietly. "Patricia Wynne has been on her phone for the past 10 minutes. Maisie murmured without looking at him directly. "And Julian Hart's associate, Marcus Steinberg, arrived 15 minutes ago, even though he was not on the guest list." Arthur felt familiar tension creep up his spine. Marcus Steinberg was Julian's primary lieutenant at Titan Industries, someone who attended social events only when conducting business that required discretion. Did Danny's monitoring equipment detect any unusual communications? 3 encrypted calls from Patricia to different numbers, plus 2 text messages to Julian's burner phone. Maisie moved closer to examine a vintage automobile photograph, bringing her within comfortable conversation distance. Whatever you announced tonight has definitely gotten their attention. Arthur studied the ballroom through peripheral vision, noting how conversations seemed to flow around invisible currents of information and influence. This was Julian's natural environment, a place where power was exercised through suggestion and inference rather than direct confrontation. "Mr. Sterling?" A familiar voice interrupted his observations. Arthur turned to find Patricia Wynne approaching with her characteristic warm smile, the expression now carrying sinister undertones given what he knew about her betrayal. "Patricia, good to see you tonight. I heard you speaking with Margaret about new community partnerships. That sounds like an interesting strategic direction." Patricia's voice carried casual interest, but Arthur caught the probing quality beneath her friendly tone. "Sometimes personal experiences reshape business priorities," Arthur replied carefully. "I have recently learned to appreciate expertise that exists outside traditional corporate structures." Patricia's gaze shifted briefly to Maisie before returning to Arthur. "The Robinson family has an excellent reputation in Hartford, though I imagine such partnerships require careful consideration of potential risks and complications." The warning was subtle but unmistakable. Patricia was reminding him that relationships with people outside his social circle could be vulnerable to attack, manipulation, or exposure. "I have found that the greatest risks often come from sources we trust most," Arthur replied, meeting Patricia's eyes directly. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we understand least." For just a moment, Patricia's composed expression flickered with something that might have been guilt or fear. Then her professional mask returned, smooth and impenetrable. "How true," she agreed. "I hope you are being appropriately cautious in your new ventures. Arthur, Hartford's business community can be surprisingly interconnected, and reputations are fragile things." After Patricia moved away, Maisie appeared at Arthur's side with 2 fresh glasses of champagne. "That sounded like a threat," she observed quietly. "It was definitely a threat. Patricia is warning me that Julian has the ability to damage both my reputation and yours if we continue our partnership." Maisie sipped her champagne thoughtfully. "Which means our performance tonight was successful. Julian is feeling threatened enough to escalate from covert sabotage to direct intimidation." Arthur looked around the ballroom one more time, seeing it now as a battlefield where weapons were social connections and ammunition was carefully crafted rumors. This was where Julian Hart held every advantage. He understood the unwritten rules, commanded respect from key players, and could destroy reputations through whispered suggestions and strategic leaks. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Arthur asked. "The question is whether you are ready," Maisie replied, turning to face him fully. "In your world, battles are fought through lawyers and financial leverage. Julian is about to attack us in ways that cannot be defended through conventional methods." Arthur looked at this remarkable woman who had entered his life 1 week ago and transformed everything he thought he understood about strength, intelligence, and partnership. She stood ready to face an enemy who could destroy her business and reputation, asking nothing except that he match her courage with his own. "Then I suppose it is time for me to learn new methods," he said. Maisie smiled, and for a moment the ballroom full of Hartford's elite faded into background noise. "In that case, Mr. Sterling, let us give Julian Hart exactly what he is afraid of." Arthur offered his arm, and together they walked toward the exit, knowing that their public departure would trigger the final phase of a conflict that had been building for months. Behind them, Conversations shifted and phone calls were made, setting in motion the events that would determine whether justice would triumph over manipulation. Whatever happened next, Arthur knew he was no longer the same man who had dismissed a mechanic on Elm Street 7 days ago. Maisie Robinson had taught him that real partnership required courage, trust, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. Now it was time to discover whether those lessons would be enough to defeat an enemy who had turned betrayal into an art form. The early morning light filtered through the windows of Robinson's auto repair, casting long shadows across tools that had witnessed 3 generations of honest work. Arthur Sterling sat on an overturned crate, watching Maisie prepare coffee in a corner office that doubled as kitchen and paperwork center. The domestic simplicity felt foreign yet comforting, a stark contrast to the corporate warfare consuming his professional life. "Danny's latest intelligence confirms Julian is accelerating his timeline," Maisie said, handing Arthur a steaming mug. "Your announcement last night triggered immediate crisis protocols throughout his network." Arthur accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how natural it felt to begin important conversations in this garage rather than his executive conference room. "What kind of crisis protocols? Emergency meetings, encrypted communications with media contacts, and financial transfers to accounts Danny associates with influence operations." Maisie settled into her grandfather's old desk chair, surrounded by framed photographs of customers whose cars had been rescued from mechanical failure. "Julian is preparing to attack both of us simultaneously through multiple channels." The scope of Julian's resources continued to astound Arthur. Corporate competition was ruthless, but generally confined to market dynamics and financial maneuvering. What Julian was orchestrating resembled political warfare, systematic destruction of opponents through coordinated public relations campaigns. "How does someone develop that kind of capability?" "Practice," Maisie replied grimly. Danny found evidence of at least 6 previous campaigns where Julian destroyed competitors through manufactured scandals and media manipulation. "We are not his first victims, just his most recent targets." Arthur felt cold anger settle in his chest as he contemplated the human cost of Julian's ambitions. How many careers had been ruined, how many lives disrupted by someone who treated other people as obstacles to be eliminated rather than competitors to be respected. "What are we looking at in terms of timeline?" "Based on previous patterns, Julian will launch his attack within 48 hours. He prefers to act decisively rather than allow opposition time to build defenses." Maisie pulled up several documents on her laptop. "Danny has identified the probable components of his strategy." Arthur leaned closer to examine the evidence, acutely aware of Maisie's proximity and the way her focused attention made her even more attractive than usual. Working together over the past week had created an intimacy that went beyond professional collaboration. They had learned to anticipate each other's thoughts, finish each other's sentences, and provide the kind of emotional support that neither had realized they needed. "Julian will attack your business reputation first," Maisie continued, apparently unaware of Arthur's distraction. "Leaked stories about Apex innovations, financial irregularities, questions about your leadership capabilities, and suggestions that your recent behavior indicates instability or poor judgment. Standard corporate character assassination, but coordinated with personal attacks designed to isolate you from allies and support systems." Maisie highlighted several documents. "Julian has been building files on your personal relationships, looking for vulnerabilities he can exploit to make you appear untrustworthy or inappropriate." Arthur felt familiar vulnerability wash over him as he realized how exposed his private life had become. Julian possessed information that could be taken out of context, relationships that could be misrepresented, and access to people who might be willing to share damaging stories for the right incentives. "What about attacks on you?" Maisie's expression darkened. "Julian will position me as a gold digger who seduced a wealthy CEO for financial gain." Suggestions that our partnership is inappropriate, that I'm using feminine wiles to manipulate your business decisions, and that my mechanical expertise is exaggerated or irrelevant. The strategy was as predictable as it was infuriating. Julian would use sexist assumptions and class prejudices to undermine Maisie's credibility, while simultaneously attacking Arthur's judgment for trusting someone outside his social circle. He is counting on people's willingness to believe the worst about both of us, Arthur observed. Exactly. And because the attacks will be coordinated across multiple media platforms, they will seem to confirm each other, even though they originate from the same source. Arthur stood and walked to the garage's main bay, looking out at Elm Street where his transformation had begun 8 days earlier. The world beyond these windows had not changed, but his understanding of it had been revolutionized by a woman who saw problems as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be avoided. "Maisie," he said carefully, "there is something I need to tell you before Julian's attacks begin." She looked up from her laptop, green eyes alert and attentive. "My feelings for you have evolved beyond professional respect or gratitude," Arthur continued, the words emerging with surprising steadiness. "You have become someone whose opinion matters more than board approval, whose safety concerns me more than quarterly profits, whose partnership has taught me things about myself that I never expected to learn." Maisie was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried warmth mixed with caution. "Arthur, the timing of this conversation is terrible. We are about to face attacks designed specifically to distort and weaponize any personal connection between us. Which is exactly why I needed to say this now, while we can still speak honestly." Arthur moved closer, but maintained respectful distance. "Whatever Julian accuses us of, whatever stories he fabricates, I want you to know that my feelings are real and have nothing to do with manipulation or calculation. And my feelings for you are equally real," Maisie replied, surprising him with her directness. "But if we acknowledge them publicly, we hand Julian exactly the ammunition he needs to destroy both of us." Arthur felt his heart race as he processed her admission alongside the strategic reality of their situation. She felt the same attraction, the same connection, the same sense of partnership that had been growing between them all week. But Julian's impending attacks would poison any public acknowledgement of their relationship. "So we pretend there is nothing between us. We focus on exposing Julian's crimes and protecting what we have built together. Personal relationships can survive media attacks if they are based on genuine connection rather than convenience or manipulation." Arthur understood the wisdom in her approach, even as every instinct urged him to ignore strategic considerations and follow his emotions. But Maisie was right. Their partnership was too important to risk on romantic impulses that Julian could exploit. "Danny is expecting us in 20 minutes, Maisie said, closing her laptop and gathering investigation materials. "He has a plan for documenting Julian's attacks while they happen, creating evidence of conspiracy that we can use to expose the entire operation." Arthur nodded, pushing personal desires aside in favor of the battle that would determine their futures. What does he need from us? Complete trust and absolute courage. Julian Hart is about to discover that some partnerships are strong enough to survive any attack he can devise. As they prepared to leave the garage together, Arthur realized that his feelings for Maisie had only grown stronger through their shared adversity. She had proven herself capable of facing any challenge with intelligence, grace, and unwavering integrity. Whatever Julian attempted over the next 48 hours, Arthur knew he wanted this woman as his partner in every aspect of life. But first, they had to survive the storm that was coming. The war room Danny Chen had established in his basement laboratory resembled something from a political campaign or military operation, with multiple screens displaying social media feeds, news websites, and communication intercepts in real time. Arthur sat surrounded by technology that could monitor every major information platform simultaneously, watching as Julian Hart's carefully orchestrated attack began to unfold. "Phase 1 is launching now," Danny announced, his fingers flying across multiple keyboards as data streams populated his monitors. Hartford Business Weekly just posted an investigative piece questioning Apex Innovations' financial transparency and Arthur's recent strategic decisions. Arthur read the article with growing dismay, recognizing how skillfully Julian had woven truth with innuendo to create a narrative of corporate instability and executive incompetence. The piece raised questions about accounting practices, suggested that Arthur's leadership had become erratic, and implied that recent business failures indicated deeper problems at Apex Innovations. "Every fact is technically accurate," Arthur observed, "but the overall impression is completely false." "That is Julian's specialty," Maisie replied, studying a separate screen showing social media activity. "He provides journalists with legitimate information that supports illegitimate conclusions." Danny highlighted several data points across his monitoring systems. "The article is being amplified through coordinated social media campaigns, industry blogs, and professional networks. Julian has spent months building the infrastructure to turn a single story into an overwhelming narrative." Arthur watched his professional reputation disintegrate in real time as the story spread through Hartford's business community with viral efficiency. Comment sections filled with speculation about Apex Innovations' stability, Arthur's mental state, and the broader implications for employees and investors. "Phase 2 incoming," Danny warned. "Local television news is running a segment about unusual partnerships between Hartford executives and service providers." The television report was more devastating than the article because it included video footage of Arthur and Maisie together at the charity auction, their body language analyzed by a reporter who suggested their relationship raised questions about Arthur's judgment and Maisie's motivations. Sources close to Apex Innovations express concern about CEO Arthur Sterling's recent association with local mechanic Maisie Robinson, the reporter intoned with practiced authority. "While Robinson's auto repair shop has a solid reputation, industry experts question whether such partnerships represent sound business strategy or personal indiscretion." Arthur felt rage build in his chest as the report continued with thinly veiled suggestions that Maisie was manipulating him for financial gain. The coverage managed to be simultaneously sexist and classist, dismissing her expertise while implying that her only value lay in feminine wiles used to seduce wealthy men. "They are attacking everything that makes you remarkable," Arthur said to Maisie, whose expression remained steady despite the character assassination playing out on screen. "They are attacking what Julian fears most," she replied calmly. "The idea that partnerships between different kinds of people can create something stronger than traditional power structures." Danny pulled up communication intercepts showing the coordination behind the media attacks. Julian's team is seeding stories across multiple platforms while monitoring social media responses to optimize their messaging. "This is sophisticated psychological warfare designed to isolate you from potential allies." The third wave arrived 30 minutes later, in the form of leaked emails, suggesting that Arthur had used corporate resources to benefit Maisie's business inappropriately. The emails were fabricated but convincing, appearing to show Arthur directing Apex Innovations facilities management to recommend Robinson's auto repair for employee vehicle maintenance contracts. "Julian's people have gotten very good at digital forgery," Danny observed as he analyzed the fraudulent communications. "These emails would fool most experts unless they knew exactly what to look for." Arthur realized that Julian's attack was more than character assassination. It was an attempt to destroy the foundation of trust and mutual respect that he and Maisie had built over the past week. By making their partnership appear corrupt or inappropriate, Julian hoped to turn their greatest strength into a devastating weakness. How do we respond? Arthur asked. We do not respond, Maisie said firmly. We document everything Julian is doing while we execute our own plan to expose his criminal activities. Danny nodded agreement. Responding to these attacks would legitimize them and create a defensive dynamic that Julian can exploit indefinitely. Instead, we focus on gathering evidence of his conspiracy while he exhausts his ammunition. Arthur felt every instinct urge him to defend himself and Maisie through public statements, press conferences, and legal action. But he had learned to trust their judgment over his own impulses, recognizing that conventional responses would play directly into Julian's strategy. What evidence do we need? He asked. Direct proof that Julian personally ordered and coordinated these attacks, Danny replied. I have been monitoring his communications, but he uses sophisticated encryption and operational security protocols that make interception difficult. So we force him to communicate more directly, Maisie said, understanding dawning in her expression. We give him a target so threatening that he has to personally intervene rather than operating through intermediaries. Arthur felt anticipation mix with anxiety as he recognized the direction of their planning. What kind of target? Danny smiled as he pulled up a new interface on one of his screens. We announce that Arthur Sterling and Maisie Robinson are forming a new company dedicated to investigating corporate fraud and supporting small businesses victimized by powerful competitors. The strategy was elegant and terrifying. Such an announcement would represent Julian's greatest nightmare, his victims joining forces to expose his methods and protect future targets. He would be forced to respond personally and decisively, creating the evidence trail they needed to prove criminal conspiracy. Julian will have to try to destroy us immediately, Arthur realized, which will require him to coordinate resources, communicate with assets, and leave digital fingerprints that we can trace directly back to him, Maisie added. Arthur looked around the war room, where they had spent the morning watching his reputation systematically destroyed, realizing that everything they had endured was preparation for this moment. Julian Hart had revealed his capabilities and methods, giving them the intelligence necessary to design a perfect trap. When do we make the announcement? Arthur asked. Tomorrow morning, Danny replied. That gives Julian's current attacks time to peak, while positioning our counter-offensive for maximum impact. Arthur reached for Maisie's hand, drawing strength from her steady confidence as they prepared for the final phase of a battle that would determine not just their individual futures, but the principle of whether justice could triumph over systematic manipulation. Together, he asked. Together, she confirmed, squeezing his hand gently. Whatever happened over the next 24 hours, Arthur knew that Julian Hart was about to learn the most important lesson of his career. Some partnerships were strong enough to survive any attack and clever enough to turn enemy strategies into self-destruction. Arthur Sterling sat alone in his penthouse office as dawn broke over Hartford, watching his empire crumble through floor-to-ceiling windows that had once made him feel invincible. The morning newspapers spread across his desk told a story of spectacular professional destruction. Apex Innovations' stock price had dropped 40% overnight. 3 major clients had suspended contracts pending investigation, and the board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss his future with the company. Julian Hart's coordinated assault had succeeded beyond Arthur's worst fears. The fabricated emails, manufactured scandals, and systematic character assassination had created a narrative of corporate corruption and personal impropriety that was now accepted as truth throughout Hartford's business community. Arthur Sterling, once celebrated as a visionary CEO, had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and questionable judgment. But the professional devastation paled compared to the personal cost. Maisie had not returned his call since yesterday's press conference, where a reporter asked directly whether she was romantically involved with the disgraced executive. Her refusal to deny the relationship had triggered another wave of vicious commentary that portrayed her as either a naive victim or calculating opportunist, depending on which narrative served the commentator's purposes. Arthur picked up his phone for the dozenth time, then set it down again without dialing. What could he say that would not make her situation worse? Every word he spoke publicly was twisted into evidence of manipulation or inappropriate conduct. His attempts to defend her only reinforced the narrative that their partnership was based on personal rather than professional considerations. The intercom buzzed with his assistant's voice. "Mr. Sterling, the board members are arriving for the 9 o'clock meeting." Arthur straightened his tie and checked his appearance in the reflection from his window, noting how much older he looked than he had 2 weeks ago. The stress of Julian's attacks had carved lines around his eyes and added grey to his temples, visible signs of a man whose carefully constructed world was disintegrating. "Send them in," he replied, steeling himself for what he knew would be the end of his tenure at Apex Innovations. The boardroom filled with faces he had known for years, colleagues who had supported his vision, friends who had celebrated his successes, advisors who had helped build the company into a $3 billion enterprise. Today they looked at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. "Arthur," Patricia Wynne spoke first, her voice carrying false sympathy that made his stomach turn. "I think we all hoped this situation would resolve itself, but the damage to our reputation and market position has become untenable." Arthur studied Patricia's face, knowing what she truly was, while watching her perform concern for an audience that remained unaware of her betrayal. The irony was devastating. The woman orchestrating his destruction was positioning herself as his greatest supporter while delivering the killing blow. "The Singapore contract has been permanently withdrawn," board member Richard Blackstone added. "2 other major clients have indicated they will not renew existing agreements. We are facing quarterly losses that could threaten the company's survival." Arthur nodded, accepting responsibility for consequences that stemmed from his enemy's manipulation rather than his own failures. "I understand the board's concerns. We need you to step down immediately," Patricia continued, her performance flawless in its apparent reluctance. "A voluntary resignation would allow us to begin rebuilding credibility with clients, investors, and the media." The request was delivered as a suggestion, but Arthur recognized it as an ultimatum backed by votes he could not overcome. Julian Hart had orchestrated not just his public humiliation, but his complete removal from the company he had spent 15 years building. "And if I refuse, then we will call for a vote of no confidence," Richard replied grimly. "Arthur, you know we care about you personally, but our fiduciary responsibility is to protect shareholder value and employee livelihoods." Arthur looked around the table at people who had once respected his judgment, valued his leadership, and trusted his integrity. Julian's campaign had poisoned every relationship, corrupted every alliance, and destroyed the foundation of mutual respect that had made Apex Innovations successful. "I need 24 hours to consider your request," Arthur said finally. Patricia's expression flickered with something that might have been concern. "Arthur, delaying this decision will only make the situation worse. Every day you remain as CEO provides more ammunition for critics and creates additional liability for the company." 24 hours, Arthur repeated, standing to signal the meeting's end. After the board members filed out, Arthur remained in the conference room, staring at the empty chairs and realizing that Julian Hart had achieved something more devastating than corporate sabotage. He had destroyed Arthur's faith in his own judgment, his confidence in his relationships, and his belief that success could be built on merit rather than manipulation. Arthur's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The board meeting went well, I trust. Perhaps it is time to consider different career opportunities. The message was unsigned, but Arthur recognized Julian's voice in every word. His former mentor was savoring this moment of complete victory, the systematic destruction of someone who had dared to surpass him professionally and personally. Arthur walked to his office window and looked down at Hartford's streets, where people were beginning their normal workdays, without knowing that one of the city's largest employers was imploding. Somewhere in that urban landscape was a garage, where an extraordinary woman was probably trying to rebuild her reputation after being dragged into a conflict that was not originally hers. The thought of Maisie facing continued attacks because of their association filled Arthur with an emotion he barely recognized as genuine despair. He had entered her life with arrogance and condescension, had drawn her into a battle against an enemy she had never chosen to fight, and had ultimately failed to protect her from consequences that threatened everything she had worked to build. His phone rang, displaying Danny Chen's number. "Arthur, we need to talk immediately." Danny's voice carried urgency that cut through Arthur's self-pity. "Julian made a mistake last night, and we have the evidence we need to destroy him completely." Arthur felt something stir in his chest that might have been hope. What kind of evidence? The kind that will put him in federal prison and vindicate both you and Maisie permanently. But we need to act fast, and it will require you to risk everything you have left. Arthur looked around his office one more time, taking in the awards, photographs, and mementos that documented 15 years of professional achievement. Julian Hart had taken his company, his reputation, and his future, but he had not yet taken Arthur's capacity for moral choice. "I will be there in 20 minutes, Arthur said. As he gathered his personal belongings, Arthur realized that Julian's greatest miscalculation had been assuming that destroying his professional life would break his spirit completely. Instead, it had freed him from the constraints of corporate respectability and conventional success metrics. For the first time in his adult life, Arthur Sterling had nothing left to lose except his integrity, and that he was finally ready to fight for with everything he had. Danny Chen's laboratory hummed with electronic activity as Arthur descended the stairs to find Maisie already there, her presence filling him with relief and regret in equal measure. She looked tired, but determined, her green eyes holding steady resolve despite the media attacks that had painted her as everything from naive victim to calculating seductress. "I am sorry," Arthur said before anyone could speak. "I am sorry I dragged you into this, sorry I could not protect you from Julian's attacks, and sorry that knowing me has cost you so much." Maisie's expression softened slightly. "Arthur, we chose to fight this battle together. I do not need protection, I need partnership." Danny cleared his throat, drawing their attention to multiple screens displaying communication intercepts, financial records, and surveillance footage. "Julian Hart made a critical error last night. His need to personally oversee your destruction led him to break his own operational security protocols." Arthur moved closer to examine the evidence, feeling anticipation replace despair as he recognized the scope of Danny's discovery. What did he do? He used his personal phone to coordinate the board meeting strategy with Patricia, including specific instructions about how to force your resignation. Danny highlighted recorded conversations that clearly established conspiracy and criminal fraud. "We have Julian's voice giving direct orders to commit corporate sabotage, media manipulation, and election interference." Maisie leaned forward, studying the technical analysis. "This proves everything we suspected but could not document before." "Better than that," Danny continued, pulling up additional files. "Julian's coordination calls included discussions about previous victims, other companies he has destroyed through similar methods. and his long-term plan to acquire Apex Innovations at a fraction of its actual value. Arthur felt cold rage replace despair as the full scope of Julian's conspiracy became clear. This was not personal revenge, but systematic predation, a business model based on destroying successful companies through manufactured crises and coordinated attacks. "How many other people has he done this to?" Arthur asked. "At least a dozen companies over the past 5 years, representing hundreds of jobs lost and billions in economic damage." Danny's voice carried disgust. "Julian Hart is not just a corporate saboteur, he is an economic terrorist who profits from systematic destruction." Maisie stood and walked to a wall covered with photographs, timelines, and connection diagrams that mapped Julian's network of accomplices and victims. "The question is how we use this evidence to stop him permanently. We have enough material to trigger federal investigations that will put Julian and his entire network in prison," Danny replied. "But presenting the evidence requires us to reveal how it was obtained, which means exposing surveillance methods that exist in legal gray areas." Arthur understood the dilemma immediately. The evidence was irrefutable, but potentially inadmissible if acquired through illegal means. Julian's lawyers would challenge every piece of digital intelligence while he continued destroying lives through legal technicalities. "There has to be another way," Arthur said. "There is," Maisie replied, turning back to face them with determination that made Arthur's pulse quicken. "We force Julian to confess publicly by giving him exactly what he wants most." Danny nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "We offer him Apex Innovations." Arthur felt the brilliance of their strategy, even as it terrified him completely. "You want me to surrender my company to Julian voluntarily, in a way that forces him to admit what he has done. We want you to announce that Julian Hart was right about your incompetence and corruption," Maisie explained. "That you are transferring control of Apex Innovations to him because he exposed truths you were too proud to acknowledge." The plan required Arthur to humiliate himself publicly while positioning Julian as a hero who had saved the company from corrupt leadership. It violated every instinct he possessed about pride, dignity, and professional reputation. "Julian's ego will not let him simply accept victory quietly," Danny added. "He will need to explain how he uncovered your supposed crimes, how he orchestrated your exposure, and how he plans to rebuild the company under ethical leadership. And when he does that," Maisie concluded, "he will confess to conspiracy, corporate sabotage, and fraud in front of cameras and witnesses who cannot be dismissed or intimidated." Disadi, Arthur walked to the laboratory's small window, looking up at street level where normal people conducted normal business without understanding how close they were to extraordinary events. In 24 hours, he could either disappear into obscurity as a disgraced executive or emerge as someone who had sacrificed everything to expose systematic corruption. "If we do this and it fails, I lose everything permanently," he said. "If we do not do this, Julian continues destroying innocent people while you lose everything anyway," Maisie replied. "At least this way, our destruction serves a purpose larger than his entertainment." Arthur turned back to face her, struck by the steady courage with which she approached problems that would terrify most people. She had already sacrificed her quiet life and peaceful business to fight for justice. Now she was asking him to match her bravery with his own. "What do you need me to do?" Arthur asked. Danny smiled as he began outlining their strategy. "We need you to call a press conference and deliver the most convincing performance of your life." Arthur looked at Maisie, drawing strength from her unwavering confidence as they prepared for a gamble that would either vindicate their partnership or destroy them both completely. Either way, they would face the consequences together, which somehow made even the possibility of total failure feel manageable. Julian Hart is about to learn that some partnerships are stronger than any attack he can devise, Arthur said. And some people are willing to sacrifice everything for justice, Maisie added, reaching for his hand. Whatever happened next, Arthur knew that Julian Hart had inadvertently created exactly what he most feared, an alliance between different kinds of people that was strong enough to challenge established power structures and expose systematic corruption. The student was about to teach the mentor a lesson he would never forget. The Hartford Convention Center's main ballroom filled with reporters, business leaders, and curious citizens drawn by advance publicity about Arthur Sterling's important announcement regarding the future of Apex Innovations. Arthur stood at the podium, looking out at faces that ranged from sympathetic to hostile, knowing that the next 30 minutes would determine not just his own fate, but the outcome of Julian Hart's entire criminal enterprise. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this morning's press conference, Arthur began, his voice carrying the defeated tone he and Danny had carefully rehearsed. I have called you here to address recent accusations about my leadership of Apex Innovations and to announce my decision regarding the company's future. In the third row, Arthur spotted Julian Hart himself, sitting with the satisfied expression of someone watching his carefully orchestrated victory unfold. Patricia Wynne sat nearby, her performance of reluctant concern flawless for anyone who did not know her true role in Arthur's destruction. Over the past 2 weeks, serious questions have been raised about my judgment, my business practices, and my fitness to lead one of Hartford's largest employers, Arthur continued, allowing genuine emotion to creep into his voice. These questions have forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own failures and the damage my arrogance has caused to this company and this community. Arthur caught Maisie's eye in the audience, drawing strength from her steady presence as he delivered lines that felt like swallowing poison. She sat in the back row, recording everything on her phone while Danny monitored Julian's communications from a surveillance van outside. I have spent my career believing that success justified any methods, that intelligence excused arrogance, and that results mattered more than relationships, Arthur said, the words containing more truth than his scripted performance required. Recent events have shown me how wrong I was and how much damage that philosophy has caused. Murmurs rippled through the audience as reporters recognized the admission they had been seeking for weeks. Arthur was not just resigning, he was confessing to the corporate corruption and personal failures that Julian's campaign had alleged. Therefore, effective immediately, I am resigning as Chief Executive Officer of Apex Innovations and transferring operational control to someone whose wisdom, integrity, and business acumen have been demonstrated through his patient efforts to expose my failures and protect this company from my poor judgment. Arthur paused, letting anticipation build as cameras focused on his face and reporters prepared to document his complete professional suicide. Julian Hart, my former mentor and current head of Titan Industries, has shown remarkable dedication to uncovering the truth about Apex Innovations' problems and proposing solutions that would restore confidence in our operations. His investigation of my activities has revealed systematic issues that require immediate correction by someone with unquestionable ethical standards. In the audience, Julian's expression shifted from satisfaction to surprise as Arthur's resignation transformed into public praise for his enemy's supposed heroism. This was not the simple capitulation Julian had expected. It was elevation to savior status that would require public acknowledgement and explanation. Mr. Hart, would you please join me at the podium to explain how your investigation uncovered these problems and share your vision for Apex Innovations' future under ethical leadership? Arthur saw Julian hesitate, recognizing the trap but unable to resist the opportunity to claim public credit for his victory. Refusing Arthur's invitation would appear suspicious, while accepting it offered the platform Julian's ego craved. Julian stood and walked to the podium with the confident stride of someone who had successfully destroyed his greatest rival. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the assembled media with the expression of a man savoring his moment of ultimate triumph. "Thank you, Arthur, for finally acknowledging what many of us have known for months," Julian began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. "Apex Innovations is too important to Hartford's economy to be damaged by one person's unchecked ambition and questionable ethics." Arthur stepped back, allowing Julian full command of the microphone and cameras while concealing his anticipation behind an expression of defeated acceptance. "My investigation began 18 months ago when I noticed irregularities in Apex Innovations' financial reporting and strategic decision-making," Julian continued, his natural arrogance overwhelming whatever caution he might have possessed. Arthur's increasing isolation from industry colleagues and his erratic behavior patterns suggested systematic problems that threatened not just his company, but the broader business community. Arthur watched Julian weave truth with fabrication, describing a methodical investigation that had actually been systematic sabotage. Every word was being recorded by multiple sources, while Danny monitored for the specific admissions they needed to trigger federal prosecution. The Singapore contract failure was merely the latest example of Arthur's poor judgment and inability to handle sophisticated negotiations, Julian said, his voice growing more confident as he warmed to his subject. His subsequent association with local service providers raised additional questions about his decision-making capabilities and susceptibility to manipulation. Arthur felt anger flare as Julian dismissed Maisie with casual condescension, but he maintained his defeated posture while cameras captured every word of Julian's confession. "My team's technical analysis revealed security vulnerabilities in Apex Innovations systems that could have been exploited by competitors or foreign agents," Julian continued, describing his own sabotage as if it were protective investigation. "The electronic interference that disabled Arthur's vehicle, for example, demonstrated how easily his personal security could be compromised by sophisticated adversaries." Arthur's pulse quickened as Julian moved closer to explicit confession, his need to demonstrate superior intelligence overriding operational caution. Coordinating media coverage of these discoveries required careful timing and strategic communication with trusted journalists who understood the broader implications, Julian said, his voice carrying the pride of someone describing professional accomplishment. Public awareness of Arthur's failures was necessary to prevent further damage to shareholders and employees. In the audience, Arthur saw reporters exchanging glances as they recognized Julian's admission to orchestrating the media campaign that had destroyed Arthur's reputation. The confession was being broadcast live across multiple platforms, while Julian remained oblivious to the legal implications of his words. "Under my leadership, Apex Innovations will return to the ethical business practices and strategic focus that make Hartford's economy strong," Julian concluded, his expression triumphant as he claimed credit for saving the company he had systematically attacked. Arthur returned to the microphone with the expression of someone accepting inevitable defeat. "Thank you, Julian, for your honesty about the methods you used to expose my failures. The federal authorities, who have been monitoring today's press conference, will no doubt appreciate such detailed explanations of your investigative techniques." Julian's expression shifted from triumph to confusion as Arthur's words registered. Around the ballroom, additional figures became visible. FBI agents and federal prosecutors who had been positioned throughout the audience to witness Julian's public confession to conspiracy, corporate sabotage, and fraud. "Julian Hart," Agent Sarah Morrison announced as she approached the podium with badge and handcuffs visible. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate sabotage, electronic interference with commerce, and fraud conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Arthur watched his former mentor's face cycle through shock, rage, and desperate calculation as federal agents moved through the audience to arrest Patricia Wynne and other conspiracy members. The trap had worked perfectly. Julian's ego and need for public recognition had led him to confess to federal crimes in front of cameras and witnesses. As Julian was led away in handcuffs, his eyes fixed on Arthur with hatred that promised this conflict was far from over. But the immediate threat was neutralized, the conspiracy exposed, and justice finally served for Julian's many victims. Arthur looked across the chaotic ballroom to find Maisie, who stood near the back with an expression of quiet satisfaction and profound relief. They had risked everything on a strategy that required perfect timing, flawless performance, and absolute trust in each other. Now they would discover whether their partnership was strong enough to survive victory as well as it had survived attack. The weeks following Julian Hart's arrest passed in a blur of federal investigations, media interviews, and corporate restructuring that gradually restored Arthur's reputation while exposing the full scope of the conspiracy against him. FBI forensic accountants traced financial connections that revealed Julian's network had destroyed dozens of companies across 6 states, representing billions in economic damage and thousands of lost jobs. Arthur sat in the conference room at Apex Innovations, meeting with the reconstituted board of directors who had voted unanimously to restore him as CEO. Patricia Wynne's arrest for corporate espionage had created a vacancy that would be filled by someone whose loyalty was beyond question, though Arthur had learned to view loyalty as something earned rather than demanded. The Singapore consortium has indicated renewed interest in our original proposal, board member Richard Blackstone reported. Apparently, our public exposure of the sabotage campaign has enhanced rather than damaged our credibility in international markets. Arthur nodded, though his attention was divided between corporate restoration and personal considerations that had grown more important than quarterly profits. Maisie had become a celebrated figure in Hartford's business community, her expertise and courage recognized through awards, speaking opportunities, and consulting contracts that could transform Robinson's Auto Repair into a regional enterprise. "Arthur, we need to discuss succession planning and organizational structure going forward," Richard continued. "Recent events have shown the importance of distributed leadership and collaborative decision-making." "I agree completely," Arthur replied. "In fact, I have been considering proposals that would democratize our operations significantly." After the board meeting concluded, Arthur walked to his office window and looked down at Hartford's streets, thinking about the woman who had changed not just his understanding of business, but his entire worldview. Maisie had taught him that real strength came from partnership rather than control, that intelligence existed in many forms, and that some values were worth more than any amount of money. His phone buzzed with a text message from Maisie, "Lunch at the usual place." Arthur smiled as he replied, "On my way." The coffee shop near Danny's laboratory had become their regular meeting place, a neutral location where they could discuss the ongoing investigation while rebuilding a relationship that had been tested by circumstances neither had anticipated. Arthur arrived to find Maisie already seated in their usual booth, reading a technical manual while drinking coffee that probably cost 1/10 of what he used to pay for executive dining. "How did the board meeting go?" she asked as he settled across from her. "They want me to restructure the entire company based on collaborative leadership principles," Arthur replied. "Apparently, having your life nearly destroyed by corporate sabotage makes you an expert on organizational ethics." Maisie smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that still made Arthur's pulse quicken after weeks of growing closer. What kind of restructuring? Profit-sharing programs, employee ownership initiatives, and community partnership projects that would integrate Apex innovations with local businesses rather than treating Hartford as simply a location for extracting value. That sounds like the company your grandfather would have built if he had possessed your resources, Maisie observed. Arthur considered the comment, realizing she was probably right. His father had begun Apex Innovations as a small family business focused on solving practical problems rather than maximizing shareholder value. Arthur had transformed it into a corporate empire that prioritized growth over everything else, losing sight of the human connections that made work meaningful. "Maisie," he said carefully, "I have been thinking about our conversation during Julian's attacks when we acknowledged feelings that the circumstances made impossible to pursue." She looked up from her technical manual, green eyes alert and cautious. "What about that conversation? Those circumstances no longer exist. Julian has been neutralized, our reputations have been restored, and we are both free to make choices based on what we want rather than what strategic considerations require." Maisie set down her coffee, giving him her complete attention in the way that always made him feel like the most important person in her world. "Arthur, what are you asking?" "I am asking whether you would consider a partnership that goes beyond fighting corporate conspiracies," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the importance of her answer. "I am asking whether you believe what we have built together could become something permanent." For a moment, the coffee shop fell silent as Maisie considered his words. Then she smiled with the same quiet confidence that had impressed him since their first confrontation on Elm Street. "Arthur Sterling, are you proposing to me in a coffee shop while I'm covered in motor oil?" Arthur looked down at her hands, noting the familiar stains that had once made him dismiss her as irrelevant. Now those same stains represented everything he valued most: competence, authenticity, and the willingness to work for things that mattered. "I suppose I am," he replied, "though I should probably point out that you have taught me to value substance over appearance, which means motor oil is actually an improvement over expensive jewelry." Maisie laughed, the sound filling Arthur with warmth that had nothing to do with corporate success or social status. "In that case, yes, I will marry you, Arthur Sterling. But only if you promise to keep your hands dirty." Arthur reached across the table to take her oil-stained fingers in his own, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "I promise to spend the rest of my life learning to value the things that actually matter." As they sat in their mismatched booth, planning a future that neither could have imagined 3 weeks earlier, Arthur realized that Julian Hart had inadvertently given him the greatest gift possible: the opportunity to discover who he truly was beneath the arrogance and assumptions that had defined his previous life. Some partnerships, he now understood, were strong enough to survive any attack and valuable enough to change everything. 1 year later, the autumn sun streamed through the windows of Robinson's Auto Repair, illuminating a space that had been transformed from a struggling family business into Hartford's premier automotive center of excellence. The main bay housed state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment funded by Apex Innovations, while the expanded training facility next door graduated its third class of women pursuing careers in technical fields. Arthur Sterling, former CEO turned hands-on business partner, emerged from beneath the hood of a vintage Mustang with grease-stained hands and a satisfied expression that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him 18 months earlier. His expensive suits had been replaced by work clothes that showed honest use. His manicured nails bore the evidence of actual labor, and his understanding of value had been revolutionized by a woman who measured worth in competence rather than credentials. "Hand me that torque wrench," Maisie called from the other side of the engine, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose expertise was now recognized throughout New England's automotive industry. Arthur located the tool and passed it over, their fingers brushing briefly in an exchange that still generated the same warmth it had when their partnership was new and uncertain. Marriage had deepened their connection without diminishing the mutual respect that formed its foundation, creating a relationship based on authentic compatibility rather than social expectations. The Hartley Foundation representatives are coming by this afternoon to review our scholarship program, Maisie said, checking the engine's timing with instruments that cost more than most people's cars. They want to expand our model to other cities. Arthur nodded, pride filling his chest as he contemplated the ripple effects of their partnership. The foundation they had established, with Apex Innovations profits, now funded technical education programs in 12 states, proving that business success could serve purposes larger than shareholder enrichment. How many applications did we receive for next semester? 247 from 36 states. Maisie's voice carried satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with changing lives. We are going to need to expand again. Arthur looked around the garage that had become his second home, taking in equipment that could diagnose any mechanical problem and walls covered with photographs of successful graduates who were building careers in fields that had once excluded them systematically. This space represented everything he had learned about real accomplishment. It solved actual problems, created genuine value, and improved lives in measurable ways. Arthur, Maisie said, wiping her hands on a shop towel that bore the logo of their joint venture, do you ever miss your old life? The corner office, the executive meetings, the feeling of controlling everything? Arthur considered the question seriously, thinking about the man he had been before a broken car on Elm Street forced him to confront his own limitations. That version of himself had possessed wealth, influence, and social status, but had lacked the connections that made life meaningful. I miss the illusion of control, he said finally. But I do not miss the isolation, the constant anxiety about maintaining appearances, or the way success felt hollow because it was built on excluding other people rather than including them. Maisie smiled as she closed the Mustang's hood, their latest restoration complete and ready to return to its grateful owner. What do you think that man would say if he could see you now? Arthur looked down at his grease-stained hands, remembering the contempt with which he had once viewed manual labor and the arrogance that had nearly cost him everything worth having. The transformation felt complete, but never finished. Every day brought new opportunities to choose partnership over control, humility over pride, and authentic value over artificial status. I think he would not understand how someone could be happy working with his hands, Arthur replied, but I also think he would be curious about why this feels more satisfying than anything he ever accomplished in a boardroom. Maisie moved closer, reaching up to brush a smudge of oil from his cheek with the tender familiarity of someone who had chosen to build a life with him, despite knowing all his flaws. Her touch carried the same electricity it had during their first awkward partnership, intensified by months of shared work and deepened understanding. Arthur, she said, her green eyes holding the warmth that still made him feel like the luckiest man in Hartford, what would you tell someone who asked you to define true wealth? Arthur pulled her closer, looking around the garage where they had built something meaningful together, a business that served their community, a marriage that honored both their strengths, and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. I used to think everything could be fixed with money, Maisie, he said, echoing words he had spoken in this same garage 12 months earlier under very different circumstances. But you showed me that true wealth comes from dirty hands, a clean heart, and the ability to change destiny, both your own and other people's. Maisie smiled and rose on her toes to kiss him, tasting like coffee and possibility and the kind of happiness that could not be purchased or inherited, but only earned through the daily choice to love someone completely. As they stood together in the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the tools and photographs that documented their shared transformation, Arthur realized that Julian Hart's attempt to destroy him had actually created the conditions for him to discover who he was meant to be. Sometimes the most valuable things in life could only be found in the most unexpected places, by the most unlikely people, through the most difficult circumstances. Maisie Robinson had not just fixed his car on that October morning. She had fixed his understanding of what made life worth living. And in return, he had learned to love not just her, but the world she had shown him, where worth was measured by contribution rather than accumulation, where intelligence was valued regardless of its source, and where two people from completely different backgrounds could build something stronger together than either could achieve alone. True wealth, Arthur now understood, had very little to do with money and everything to do with finding someone who could change your destiny while allowing you to change theirs in return. He had grease on his hands, love in his heart, and a future full of possibilities he could never have imagined from the heights of his former arrogance. It was, he realized, exactly where he belonged. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.